Have you ever come across a recipe so simple, so humble, that you can almost feel the hands that made it long before you were born? The kind of food that doesn't just tell a story, but brings you into it? That's the feeling a lot of families knew when they bit into a fried green tomato cornbread sandwich. This wasn't a dish created by chefs or written down in glossy cookbooks. It came from home kitchens scattered across the rural South, where people cooked with instinct, memory, and whatever they had on hand. The ingredients were familiar, the steps were modest, but the result carried a surprising amount of comfort. Cornbread was often the first thing to come out of the oven in many households. It was cheap to make, filling, and reliable in a world that didn't always offer consistency. Green tomatoes showed up when the season was changing, and the last tomatoes on the vine never got the chance to ripen. Frying them in a hot skillet gave them a firm bite and a bright tang. Put the two together, and you had a sandwich that was warm, hearty, and deeply tied to a way of life. People didn't think of this sandwich as thrifty. They thought of it as normal. It was the kind of everyday supper a tired farmer could put together for his kids after sunset. It was the kind of thing a grandmother could make without measuring a single ingredient. It showed how families made flavor out of limitations, stretching the harvest as far as it could go. Looking back now, the fried green tomato cornbread sandwich feels almost symbolic. It captures a moment when rural communities relied on their gardens, their cast iron skillets, and their own resourcefulness. It's a reminder that food doesn't need to be complicated to hold meaning. Sometimes the quiet recipes are the ones that last the longest. 1. Sugar butter rice. There was a time when a bowl of sweet warm rice could make a child's whole day. For many Black families in the 1960s, sugar butter rice wasn't just a quick breakfast or a cheap dessert. It was one of those small, steady comforts that made a household feel held together, even when money was tight. Sugar butter rice came from a long tradition of stretching what you had. Leftover rice was never thrown away. Mothers saved it in the icebox, knowing it could be turned into something warm and filling the next morning. All it took was a pat of butter, a spoonful of sugar, and just enough milk to make everything silky. The smell alone was enough to bring every kid to the table. It didn't matter if there was no bacon, no sausage, and no store-bought cereal. This was enough. For many families, rice was cheaper than bread. It was easy to buy in bulk and lasted far longer. Kids didn't care about the economics behind it. They loved how the butter pooled at the bottom of the bowl, how the sugar softened into the grains, and how each bite felt warm and familiar. Mothers loved it for a different reason. It was one of the few things that stretched far, fed everyone, and never left anyone complaining. What made this dish matter wasn't only its price, it was the ritual behind it. A pot of rice on the stove meant the house was waking up. It meant someone was in the kitchen making sure everyone started the day with something in their stomach. In a decade where many Black families carried the weight of long work hours, discrimination, and limited opportunities, these small bowls of sweetness offered a moment of peace. And there was something else, something kids often didn't notice until they were older. Sugar butter rice was a dish born from survival but seasoned with love. Mothers weren't just feeding children. They were trying to create joy where there wasn't much room for it. A cheap bag of rice, a little butter, a little sugar. That was all they had to work with, yet somehow it felt like plenty. Still, the twist behind this comfort was simple. Families often made sugar butter rice because there wasn't anything else. The sweetness softened the truth, but the truth was still there. Many children who begged for it didn't realize that this little treat was also a sign of how close the margins were. Yet looking back, most remember the taste long before they remember the struggle. As the mornings moved on and the bowls were scraped clean, mothers would wash up and begin the next stretch of the day. And With that warm memory in place, we move to the next dish, another example of how simple foods carried entire households. Number 2, cornbread and milk supper. There was a certain quiet comfort in a bowl of crumbled cornbread swimming in cold milk. It wasn't fancy, and it wasn't meant to be. But for many Black families in the 1960s, this simple dish felt like a soft landing at the end of a long day. Kids didn't think about it as a budget meal. They just knew it tasted good, cooled them down in the summer, and filled them up when appetites were loud but the pantry was thin. Cornbread and milk supper had deep roots. Generations before, families relied on cornmeal because it was cheap, dependable, and stretched farther than flour. A single pan of cornbread could last all day, and nothing ever went to waste. By the time the 1960s rolled around, this habit had become tradition. If there was leftover cornbread from dinner, it had a second life waiting in the bowl. Mothers would crumble it with their hands, pour in cold milk, maybe add a spoon of sugar if they had it, and set it on the table like it was the most natural thing in the world. What made this dish matter wasn't just the price or the convenience, it was the feeling it carried. Many kids came home tired from long walks from school or hours of chores, and that bowl of cornbread and milk felt like instant relief. The mix of textures, the crumble, the chill, the softening edges, made it something kids asked for again and again. It didn't remind them of struggle. It reminded them of evenings when the house quieted down and everyone found something small to enjoy. Mothers leaned on this dish because it never failed. If there was no money for meat, this worked. If the stove had been busy all day and no one wanted to cook again, this worked. If the summer heat made hot meals unbearable, this cooled everyone down. The practicality behind it was clear, but the sweetness of the memory came from something else. Kids felt cared for, even when resources were stretched as far as they could go. Still, hidden under the comfort was a truth many children didn't see until they were grown. Cornbread and milk supper often appeared on nights when the kitchen had nothing else to give. It was both a blessing and a signal. It filled bellies and softened hard days, yet it also marked the realities of tight budgets, small paychecks, and mothers doing everything they could to make sure no one went to sleep hungry. Those quiet sacrifices stayed tucked inside every bite. Looking back, most people remember the chill of the milk, the grainy crumble, and the way the whole bowl tasted like home. It was a dish that carried whole families through weeks when money had to stretch farther than anyone liked to admit. And from there, we moved to another food that stretched even further and brought its own kind of joy. Number 3, fried fatback strips. For a lot of Black kids growing up in the 1960s, the sound of fatback hitting a hot skillet was enough to pull them straight into the kitchen. Fried fatback strips were salty, crispy, and full of flavor. They were the kind of treat that made kids hover around the stove, waiting for the next batch to finish. What children saw as a crunchy snack was, for mothers, a clever way to turn something inexpensive into something memorable. Fatback had been a staple in Black households for generations. It was cheap, stored well, and carried a deep, smoky flavor that could lift almost any dish. Families used it to season greens, beans, and stews. But when money was tight and meat was scarce, some mothers fried the strips on their own. The curls, the sizzle, the smell filling the house, those little things made fried fatback strips feel special, even though they were humble as could be. Kids loved the taste. Fatback fried right was almost like an early version of a salty snack, long before chips were common in every home. The edges curled up, turning crisp and golden. The crackle stayed on your fingers. Some kids ate them plain. Others sprinkled a pinch of sugar on top to mix salty with sweet. It didn't matter how they ate it, they just knew it was good. But the deeper story sat in the background. Fried fatback strips were born out of necessity. They filled in the gaps on days when the grocery budget hit its limit. Mothers knew how to make the most out of every scrap. A single strip could flavor a whole pot of beans, but when there wasn't much else in the house, that same strip became the meal itself. They made it look effortless, but there was a quiet calculation in every choice. Fatback wasn't just food, it was strategy. The twist behind this dish was simple and sharp. Kids often begged for fried fatback because it tasted amazing, not realizing it showed how stretched the family resources were. The love wrapped around it softened the truth, but the truth was still there. A salty snack was easier to enjoy than the reality behind it. Yet these moments became memories that stuck. The crackle of the skillet, the smell in the air, the warm kitchen, those were the pieces kids carried with them into adulthood. Looking back, many remember standing next to the stove, hoping to grab the next hot strip before anyone else did. It was a small joy in a world full of larger hardships. And from here, we move to something sweeter, softer, and just as tied to childhood comfort. Those thick slices of bread drizzled with molasses. Number 4. Molasses bread ends. There was something almost magical about the way a drizzle of molasses could turn a stale heel of bread into a treat kids begged for. In many black households during the 1960s, molasses bread ends were one of those small homemade snacks that didn't look like much but tasted like childhood. Mothers didn't need a pantry full of ingredients or store-bought sweets. All they needed was yesterday's bread and a bottle of thick, dark molasses that seemed to last forever. Number 4. Molasses bread ends. There was something almost magical about the way a drizzle of molasses could turn a stale heel of bread into a treat kids begged for. In many black households during the 1960s, molasses bread ends were one of those small homemade snacks that didn't look like much but tasted like childhood. Mothers didn't need a pantry full of ingredients or store-bought sweets. All they needed was yesterday's bread and a bottle of thick, dark molasses that seemed to last forever. Molasses had a long history in the South and in black cooking. It was cheap, shelf-stable, and strong enough in flavor that a little went a long way. Families used it to sweeten oatmeal, glaze biscuits, and even mix into hot water for a quick drink. But one of the simplest and most loved uses came in the form of bread ends. Those pieces were usually ignored, the tough, dry slices no one wanted for a sandwich. But mothers saw value in everything. They saved them, softened them with a slow pour of molasses, and suddenly the scraps became treasure. For kids, the appeal was instant. Molasses had a deep sweetness that felt different from sugar. It was almost smoky, almost earthy, and it clung to the bread in thick ribbons. Children licked it off their fingers and tore into every bite like it was dessert. It didn't matter that the bread was old. The molasses gave it new life. On days when the house was quiet or the weather kept everyone indoors, this little snack made the hours feel warmer. But the meaning behind molasses bread ends ran deeper than the taste. This dish was a reflection of how far Black families had learned to stretch ingredients. Wasting food wasn't an option, not in households where every dollar mattered. Mothers turned cast-offs into comfort, proving again and again that creativity in the kitchen could make up for what the wallet lacked. What kids saw as a treat was, in reality, another way their mothers shielded them from hardship. The twist behind this nostalgic snack is easy to overlook. Many children didn't realize that molasses was often used because it was the cheapest sweetener available. Honey was expensive. Maple syrup was out of reach. White sugar had to be rationed. But molasses, thick, affordable, and powerful, was the sweet flavor of survival. Still, no one felt deprived. The richness of it made kids feel like they were getting something special, even if the family was counting every penny. Looking back, most people remember the slow pour, the sticky fingers, and how quiet the room got when everyone had their slice. It was one of those foods that made the world feel steady, even if the world outside the kitchen was anything but. And from the sweet simplicity of molasses soaked bread, we head toward a dish built on patience, thrift, and deep flavor. Number 5, neck bone stew. There was a kind of comfort that only came from a pot simmering on the back of the stove, filling the whole house with a deep, meaty smell. For many black families in the 1960s, neck bone stew was that comfort. It was one of those dishes that didn't look like much at first glance, but mothers knew how to coax every bit of flavor out of the cheapest cuts. Kids didn't ask for it because it was fancy. They asked for it because it tasted like home. Neck bones were one of the most affordable meats you could buy, but low cost didn't mean low flavor. When cooked slow and steady, the meat softened, the bones released richness, and the broth turned hearty and satisfying. Families had been stretching neck bones since long before the 1960s. It was a survival skill passed down through generations. By the time this decade arrived, the dish had become tradition. A pot of neck bones meant the house was cared for, even if the grocery list had been short that week. Kids loved the ritual that came with it. They watched mothers rinse the bones, season them, and lower them into the pot. They listened to the steady bubbling as the stew thickened. And when dinner finally came around, they reached into their bowls with eager hands, picking through tender meat and soft vegetables. Every bite felt warm, filling, and better than anything you could buy ready-made. For mothers, neckbone stew mattered for practical reasons. A single pack of bones could stretch into a meal big enough to feed everyone. Add potatoes, onions, rice, or whatever the pantry allowed, and you had a full pot that lasted through dinner and often into the next day. It was a dish built on patience and resourcefulness. Long cooking times masked the truth that the ingredients were minimal. The end result looked and tasted far richer than the cost behind it. But the twist behind neckbone stew lived in the space between what kids tasted and what their parents understood. Children just thought it was delicious. They didn't know that neck bones were one of the only cuts families could afford. They didn't realize the stew pot was often a shield against nights when money was too tight for anything else. The slow simmering didn't just tenderize meat, it softened the realities of tight budgets and long work weeks. What landed in a child's bowl was comfort, not struggle. Looking back, many people remember the steam fogging the kitchen windows, the way the broth thickened as it cooked, and the quiet excitement of waiting for the ladle to come their way. Neckbone stew wasn't just a dinner. It was a reminder that even with little, families could create something that felt generous. And now we move from a dish shaped by slow patience to one born from quick ingenuity. 6. Pan-fried biscuits. If you grew up in a black household during the 1960s, you probably remember the smell of something frying long before you reached the kitchen. Pan-fried biscuits had a way of pulling kids out of bed, out of play, and straight toward the stove. They were simple, fast, and made from whatever biscuit dough was left from the morning or the night before. But in the hands of a black mother, trying to stretch every ingredient, those scraps became something golden and unforgettable. Biscuits were already a staple in many families. Flour was cheap, and a batch of dough could be adjusted to fit whatever the pantry allowed. But when the oven was too hot to run in summer, or when there wasn't enough dough left to make a full new pan, mothers turned to the skillet. A little oil, or even leftover bacon grease was all they needed. Once the dough hit the hot surface, it puffed, browned, and crisped along the edges. Kids didn't think about the technique behind it. They cared about the taste. Pan-fried biscuits had a texture unlike anything from the oven. They were chewy in the middle, crispy on the outside, and carried the warm flavor of whatever fat had been used to fry them. Some kids ate them plain. Others dipped them in syrup, jam, or even a dusting of sugar. No matter how they were served, they felt like a treat, even though they were made from scraps. For mothers, this dish mattered because it meant nothing went to waste. Every pinch of flour, every bit of dough, every spoonful of grease was used with purpose. Pan-fried biscuits were quick to make, filling, and perfect for mornings when time was tight or evenings when the budget was stretched thin. They also saved fuel. Heating a cast iron skillet took far less work than heating an oven, especially in houses where the electric bill had to be watched closely. But the quiet truth behind these biscuits was one many kids didn't understand until adulthood. Pan-fried biscuits often appeared on days when the family was running low on ingredients. This wasn't a planned special treat. It was ingenuity in action. Mothers turned leftovers into something children would love, so they never felt the stress sitting behind those decisions. The sizzle in the skillet hid the strain in the budget. The smell of frying dough softened whatever heaviness the week had carried. Looking back, most people remember the warmth of the kitchen, the quick flip of the dough, and the first bite while the biscuit was still too hot to hold. These small moments stayed with them because they were built from care. Pan-fried biscuits were inexpensive, but they carried a richness that didn't come from ingredients. It came from intention. And now we move from skillet-made comfort to one of the simplest yet most beloved sweet snacks of the era. Number 7. Cold sweet potato slices. There was something honest and comforting about a cold sweet potato pulled straight from the icebox. For many black kids in the 1960s, this wasn't just a leftover. It was a treat they looked forward to, the kind of simple snack that tasted like someone had thought of them even when nothing special was planned. Sweet potatoes were cheap, filling, and easy to keep on hand, which made them one of the quiet heroes of the kitchen. Sweet potatoes had been part of black cooking for generations. They grew well in poor soil, stored for months, and carried more sweetness than most vegetables. Families baked several at a time, knowing they could last through the week. And when one or two were left over, mothers didn't toss them. They left them in the icebox to chill until some hungry child grabbed one and peeled it like fruit. The skin slipped off easily, and the cold flesh underneath tasted naturally sweet, almost like a dessert without the sugar. Kids loved how simple it was. No pots, no stove, no waiting. Just reach in, grab one, and eat. The coolness made it refreshing in the summer, and the sweetness made it feel like a reward. Some kids sprinkled a little cinnamon. Others ate it plain. Many remember standing with the refrigerator door open a few seconds longer than they should have, biting straight into the soft orange potato before anyone told them to close it. For mothers, cold sweet potatoes mattered because they did so much with so little. They were packed with nutrients, filled stomachs fast, and cost far less than snacks from the store. They didn't spoil quickly, and they were reliable when the week's grocery money started thinning out. A single baked potato could quiet several hungry kids while dinner simmered. It looked effortless, but behind it was a long line of women who understood exactly to keep a household going on careful planning and steady habits. But the twist behind this snack was the way it blurred the line between necessity and luxury. Children begged for cold sweet potatoes, not because they knew times were tight, but because they genuinely loved the taste. They didn't know that sweet potatoes often appeared on the table because they were cheaper than most anything else. They didn't see the budget decisions or the pressure that shaped the weekly meals. What they saw was a bright orange treat that felt like something special. Years later, many people look back on these potatoes with a different understanding. They remember the cool sweetness, the soft texture, and the way it felt to hold one in their hands. And they also remember the quiet strength of the women who made sure there was always something to eat, even when options were thin. That combination turned a simple root vegetable into a lasting memory. From this cool natural sweetness, we move to a dish that warmed the stove, the table, and everyone seated around it, the slow, simmering comfort of tomato gravy on rice. 8. Tomato gravy on rice. There was a time when the scent of tomato gravy drifting through a house could family together faster than a supper bell. For many black kids in the 1960s, tomato gravy on rice was more than a budget meal. It was one of those dishes that made a home feel full, even when the pantry wasn't. Kids didn't care that it came from a can of tomatoes or the last tomato in the basket. They cared about the way it tasted, warm, tangy, and comforting. Tomato gravy had long roots in Southern kitchens. It started as a quick way to stretch the last of the tomatoes into something that could feed a crowd. Mothers sautéed onions or fatback if they had it, stirred in canned or fresh tomatoes, added a little flour to thicken it, and let everything bubble into a smooth, savory sauce. When they poured it over a mound of hot rice, dinner felt complete. It was simple, but it carried the kind of flavor that filled a room. For kids, this dish felt hearty and satisfying. The tomatoes brought a brightness that cut through long days, and the rice soaked up every drop of gravy. Some families added sugar to balance the acidity. Others added black pepper for more bite. No version was fancy, but each one left kids scraping their bowls. When the week felt long and the cupboard wasn't generous, tomato gravy was the answer that made everyone feel like they were getting something good. For mothers, tomato gravy on rice mattered because it was dependable. Rice was cheap and easy to buy in bulk. Tomatoes, whether fresh or canned, were affordable and lasted. A single pot could stretch across several plates without making the budget buckle. And because the dish cooked quickly, it helped on nights when mothers came home tired from long shifts and still had to feed a household. It was both a shortcut and a solution. But the truth behind this comforting dish was layered. Kids often saw it as one of their favorite meals, not realizing it sometimes appeared because the family had run out of meat. Mothers used tomato gravy to turn a few ingredients into a full supper, masking scarcity with flavor. The bright red sauce did more than season the rice. It softened the reality of tight beginnings and uncertain paychecks. The children weren't supposed to feel the pressure behind the pot, and thanks to dishes like this, many didn't. Looking back, many people remember the sound of the spoon scraping the pot, the way the gravy thickened as it simmered, and the deep color that told you it was ready. They remember crowding around the table with bowls that steamed up their faces, feeling cared for, even when the house was stretching every dollar. From the tangy warmth of tomato gravy, we moved to another dish where a few basic ingredients came together to create big, comforting flavor. Number 9, salt pork and cabbage skillet. There was a certain comfort in hearing cabbage hit a hot skillet, followed by the soft crackle of salt pork turning crisp. For many black families in the 1960s, salt pork and cabbage skillet wasn't just supper. It was the kind of meal that made the whole house smell warm and familiar. Kids didn't ask where it came from or why it showed up so often. They just knew it tasted good and filled their plates all the way to the edges. Salt pork had long been one of the most accessible cuts of meat in black communities. It was inexpensive, lasted a long time, and packed a flavor strong enough to season almost anything. Cabbage was the perfect partner. It was cheap, filling, and could stretch across an entire household. When the two came together, they made a skillet that fed everyone without asking much from the grocery budget. Kids loved this dish because it had everything they enjoyed. The salt pork fried into crispy bits that felt like a treat all on their own. The cabbage softened but kept a slight bite, soaking up the smoky flavor from the meat. Every forkful felt hearty. When there was cornbread on the side, it was even better. Many kids didn't realize how simple the ingredients were. They only cared that it tasted like a real, full dinner. For mothers, salt pork and cabbage skillet mattered because it worked every single time. A single piece of salt pork could flavor an entire pot, which made it one of the most efficient ingredients in the kitchen. Cabbage was easy to store, forgiving to cook, and inexpensive enough that families could buy it even in tight weeks. Mothers knew how to stretch these ingredients so skillfully that no one at the table ever felt the stretch behind it. But like so many dishes from this era, the quiet twist behind it reveals a lot about the times. Kids often begged for this skillet, not understanding why it showed up during the leanest weeks. They didn't know that the dinner they loved was a sign the family was making careful choices. Salt pork was one of the few meats families could count on, and cabbage could carry a meal farther than most vegetables. Mothers weren't just cooking, they were solving problems with every slice, stir, and seasoning. Looking back, many people remember how the windows fogged up when the skillet was going, how the cabbage wilted just right, and how the smell of salt pork filled every corner of the house. They remember gathering around the table with bowls big enough to feel generous. It wasn't a fancy meal, but it was steady, satisfying, and full of quiet care. And now we move from this smoky skillet dish to something sweeter and often saved for days when kids needed a little lift. Number 10, peanut butter syrup on biscuits. There was something special about the way peanut butter syrup melted into a warm biscuit. For a lot of black kids in the 1960s, this was the kind of sweet treat that made them come running the moment they smelled biscuits coming out of the oven. It wasn't store-bought, and it didn't come from a fancy recipe. It came from a mother who knew how to make something joyful out of the simplest ingredients she had on hand. Peanut butter syrup had its roots in homes where dessert didn't always come from a bakery or a box. Peanut butter was cheap, filling, and easy to stretch. Mothers mixed it with a little hot water, sugar, and sometimes a splash of vanilla to create a thin, warm syrup that poured easily. It soaked into biscuits, bread scraps, or leftover rolls and turned them into something sweet enough to feel like a reward. Kids loved every part of it. They watched the syrup drip down the sides of the biscuits, filling the cracks and soaking into the dough. They scraped their plates to catch every drop. The flavor was rich but simple. It didn't taste like candy or cake. It tasted like something made just for them, right there in their own kitchen. For mothers, this dish mattered because it gave them a way to offer sweetness without spending much. A single jar of peanut butter could work magic in a dozen ways. Sandwiches, snacks, and on the most special days, this syrup. It turned dry biscuits into something soft and indulgent, and because it used ingredients that were already in the pantry, it didn't strain the weekly budget. Mothers knew how to stretch every dollar, but they also knew how to keep their children feeling cared for. The twist behind peanut butter syrup on biscuits sits in that contrast. Kids begged for it because it tasted amazing. They didn't know it often showed up when the family couldn't afford store-bought sweets or when payday was still days away. Mothers used creativity to cover the gaps, turning plain food into treats, so their children never felt the strain behind the scenes. The syrup covered more than biscuits. It covered worry. Looking back, people remember the smell of warm biscuits, the shine of the syrup, and the way everyone hovered in the kitchen hoping to get theirs before the pan emptied. They remember licking sticky fingers and asking for seconds. What stayed with them wasn't the cost or the scarcity. It was the feeling of being loved in small, thoughtful ways. And now we move from this soft, sweet dish to something hearty and full of crunch, the smoky, textured tradition of crackling cornbread. When you step back and look at this simple sandwich, it becomes clear why it stayed with so many families for so long. It wasn't just about taste. It was about what it represented. Cornbread and green tomatoes were among the most dependable ingredients people had, and turning them into a sandwich made for households that didn't waste anything. The first bite carried a crisp edge, a soft middle, and a bright tang that cut through the heaviness of the day. It was practical, inexpensive, and filling. But beneath that, it was a small act of care in homes where meals were one of the few things that brought everyone together. Food like this didn't need fancy stories because it was woven into daily life. Today, many people rediscover dishes like this out of curiosity, nostalgia, or a desire to understand how earlier generations lived. What they often find is that these recipes aren't relics, they're reminders. They help us see how much can be done with very little and how creativity often comes from working within limits. The fried green tomato cornbread sandwich may not appear in modern cookbooks, but its place in American food history is solid. It reflects a time when families cooked with intention and made meals that were both practical and comforting. Remembering dishes like this helps keep those stories alive, and sometimes all it takes is one bite to understand why they mattered so much.